The heavy iron wheels of the asylum carriage sank deep into the freezing mud outside the forge. Inside the dark, soot-stained walls, Elias, a giant of a man, sat perfectly still on the dirt floor. He didn't blink. He didn't fight. He merely stared at the empty hearth while his late wife's sister wiped away a perfectly rehearsed tear, her fingers secretly clutching the legal deed to his property. The town whispered that grief had driven the massive blacksmith violently insane. They called him a mute, a monster, a broken brute who deserved the heavy iron chains they brought for him. But they were wrong. Elias's silence was not madness. It was a brutal psychological cage, forged not of iron but of carefully manipulated paper and a cruelty so deep it defied belief. And they had no idea that a disgraced aging baker standing quietly in the corner had already found the key. When she finally breaks her silence, the undeniable truth will make the entire town tremble. Before we step inside the freezing dark of the forge, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? 30 years of flour lived in the deep cracks of Nora's knuckles. The white powder was driven permanently into her skin, a map of a life spent feeding a town that now turned its back on her. The hammer struck the oak door of her bakery twice. The eviction notice fluttered in the bitter, freezing wind. Mr. Vance, the grain merchant, stood safely on the boardwalk. His wool coat was immaculate. 6 months ago, during the brutal wheat blight, he had smiled. He had offered a warm handshake and a paper filled with dense, elegant script, a loan to keep her ovens burning. Yesterday, he called the note due. The fine print was a trap. The theft was perfectly legal. Nora stood on the frost-covered planks. She did not scream. She did not beg. Begging changed nothing. She simply untied her flour-stained apron, folded it into a tight square, and laid it on the empty flour barrel. She walked out the back door. The town watched through glass windows. The sheriff stood near the bank, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, silently enforcing the merchant's greed. The preacher stood on the church steps, folding his hands in solemn, empty prayer. No one offered her a heavy coat. No one offered a chair by their warm hearth. An aging woman with empty pockets was not a neighbor. She was a burden. The cold was immediate. It seeped straight through her thin wool shawl. By dusk, hunger began to twist her stomach into sharp, hard knots. Survival requires trade. Nora had nothing left but her physical labor. The town council had a problem that required cheap labor. Elias, the blacksmith. 3 years ago, his forge was the beating heart of the valley. The rhythmic strike of his heavy hammer against the anvil could be heard for miles. Then his young wife died of a sudden, violent fever. Elias broke. The town claimed the grief had driven the giant violently insane. They whispered that he had smashed his own tools, that he growled at shadows, that he was a feral beast waiting to kill. Martha, his late wife's sister, now controlled the estate. She dressed in heavy mourning black, dabbing her eyes in public. She paid the town council a meager, insulting sum to have scraps delivered to the forge, keeping him alive just long enough for the asylum paperwork to clear. The delivery boys were terrified. The working men refused to go near the property. They needed someone desperate. They found Nora. The sheriff handed her a heavy wooden bucket and a single copper coin. Nora looked at the coin. She closed her scarred hand over it. The stew inside the bucket was gray, congealed, and smelled of sour fat. It was slop meant for a dying dog. The journey to the edge of the woods was brutal. The winter wind was a physical force pushing against her chest. The mud on the trail had frozen into jagged, solid ruts that bit through the thin, worn leather of her boots. Freezing water soaked her wool socks. Her joints, thickened by decades of kneading heavy dough, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She shifted the heavy wooden bucket from her right hand to her left. The iron handle dug deep into her palm. She did not cry. Crying did not warm her room. Crying did not bake bread. She kept her lips pressed tightly together, her head bowed against the biting wind, and watched the frozen dust rise around her boots. She placed one heavy foot in front of the other. Endurance was a muscle, and it was the only currency she had left. The woods were dead. The pines stood like black spears against the heavy gray sky. There were no birds. There was no sound of life. After an hour of silent walking, the forge appeared. It did not look like a place of business. It looked like a tomb. There was no smoke rising from the stone chimney, no warm glow leaking from the heavy shutters. The massive wooden double doors were scarred and weathered, sagging heavily on their rusted iron hinges. The yard was a graveyard of broken wagon wheels, scrap metal, and dead weeds frozen into the hard earth. Nora stopped. The wind whipped her shawl. A normal woman would have felt fear. The town had told her a monster lived inside. Nora felt nothing but the freezing cold. Monsters in the dark did not scare her. Men with fine print and legal papers were the real monsters, and they lived comfortably in the center of town. She stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under her weight. She didn't knock. Knocking required an expectation of an answer. She leaned her weight against the heavy timber door and pushed. It creaked open, scraping harshly against the dirt floor. The smell hit her first. It was not the sharp, clean smell of hot iron and burning coal. It was the smell of damp earth, stale sweat, and decaying rot. It smelled like giving up. The darkness inside was absolute, save for a single shaft of gray light cutting through a crack in the roof. Nora let her eyes adjust. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, cutting off the wind. The silence in the room was heavy. It pressed down on her lungs. Then she saw him. Elias did not look like a monster. He looked like a mountain that had collapsed in on itself. He sat in the farthest corner of the room, his back pressed hard against the freezing stone wall. His knees were drawn up to his chest. A massive, heavy wool blanket, moth-eaten and stiff with dirt, was draped over his broad shoulders. His hair was a thick, matted tangle of black and gray, hanging over his face. His beard was wild. He did not move when the door opened. He did not flinch at the biting wind that swept in. He just stared. His eyes were fixed on the dead, gray ash in the great stone hearth. They were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow. The town called him violently insane. They said he was a feral beast. Nora saw no beast. She saw a man who had forgotten how to breathe deeply. The forge around him was a graveyard of abandoned purpose. The great iron anvil sat in the center of the room, coated in a fine layer of white frost. The heavy hammers, tongs, and iron rods hung on the walls, rusting in the damp air. The leather bellows, once used to breathe roaring fire into the coals, were cracked and stiff. Everything was dead. Nora walked forward. Her boots made no sound on the packed dirt floor. She stopped 5 feet away from him. She set the wooden bucket down. The metal handle clanked sharply against the wood. Elias did not blink. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged rhythms. Nora looked at the bucket. The gray slop had a thick layer of congealed fat on top. It was an insult to the stomach. It was an insult to human dignity. She looked from the bucket to the giant's hands. They rested limp on his knees. They were massive hands, thick fingers, scarred knuckles, palms calloused from years of gripping white-hot iron, hands that had built the town. Now they were perfectly still, coated in a layer of old, dark grime. She stood in the silence, the cold bit at her exposed neck. "Eat," she said. Her voice was flat, gravelly from disuse. He did not move. He did not acknowledge the sound of another human being. Nora did not repeat herself. She did not coax him. She was not his mother. She was a ruined baker paid a single copper coin to deliver garbage. She turned her back to the giant and walked to the door. She grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled it open. The wind howled, rushing back into the dead forge. She stepped out into the freezing afternoon and pulled the door shut, dropping the iron latch with a heavy thud. The walk back to town was harder. The wind was against her now. She found a hollowed-out space under the floorboards of the abandoned livery stable to sleep that night. She wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders. She pulled her knees to her chest, mirroring the broken giant in the forge. The cold seeped up from the frozen earth, aching in her bones. She closed her eyes. The next day was the same. The sheriff handed her a copper coin. The preacher's wife handed her a bucket of boiled potato skins and gristle. Nora walked the freezing path. She opened the heavy door. Elias was in the exact same position. The bucket from the day before was untouched. The fat had frozen solid. Nora picked up the old bucket and set the new one down. She did not speak. She walked out. On the third day, the snow began to fall. It was a fine, hard snow that stung the cheeks like ground glass. The bucket held sour milk and stale crusts. Nora walked the path. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The flour embedded in her skin felt like ice. She opened the door to the forge. Elias was still in the corner, but this time he was shaking. It was not a shiver of the cold. It was a violent, rhythmic tremor that shook his massive frame. His head was bowed, his face buried in his dirty hands. A low, guttural sound clawed its way out of his throat. It was not a growl. It was a whimper. Nora stopped. On the dirt floor 2 feet away from the giant lay a small, leather-bound book. A diary. The pages were open. Nora looked at the book. She looked at the trembling man. He was not staring at the dead ash today. He was staring at the open pages. The sight of the ink on the paper seemed to act like a physical blow, striking him over and over again. He curled tighter into a ball, his massive shoulders heaving as he tried to make himself small. He was trying to disappear. Nora did not step closer. She watched. She observed the mechanics of his pain. The town said he was mad. The town said he was a danger to others. Nora watched the giant cower before a small book. She knew what danger looked like. This was not it. This was torture. She set the bucket of sour milk down. She picked up the bucket of frozen slop from yesterday. She did not look at the book again. She turned and walked out into the falling snow. The void was established. The lowest point had been reached. 2 discarded humans existing in the freezing margins of a town that wanted them dead. One frozen by the theft of her livelihood, the other paralyzed by the ink on a page. The foundation of the cold was set. The exile was absolute. On the 4th day, the snow stopped. The air turned brittle and sharp. A pristine black lacquered buggy stood outside the forge. The horse was a fine chestnut breathing plumes of white steam into the freezing air. It did not belong in the dead yard. Nora walked up the path. The heavy bucket of scraps pulled at her shoulder socket. Her boots crunched against the hard ice. She pushed the heavy timber door open. Martha stood in the center of the room. She wore a tailored dress of heavy black wool, trimmed in expensive velvet. A silver cross hung perfectly centered on her chest. Her boots were polished leather, pristine and completely free of the forge's heavy dirt. She held a lace handkerchief over her nose, her eyes scanning the soot-stained walls with deep disgust. Elias was in his corner. He was pushed back as far as a man could go, his massive frame wedged against the intersection of the stone walls. His eyes were locked on Martha. He was trembling. The violent, rhythmic shaking made his heavy teeth chatter. Martha turned as the door creaked. Her eyes swept over Nora. She saw the flour deep in the wrinkles of the older woman's skin. She saw the frayed edges of her thin shawl. She saw defeat. That was exactly what she wanted to see. "You are the baker," Martha said. Her voice was smooth. It sounded like oiled silk. It sounded like poison. Or rather, the woman who used to be a baker. Nora did not answer. She stood holding the bucket. "The town council hired you because no one else would take the copper," Martha continued, her tone conversational, pleasant even. "I told them it was a waste of town funds. A rabid dog doesn't need a keeper. It needs to be put down. But the judge insists on observing the proper legal waiting period." Martha took a slow, deliberate step toward Elias. Elias flinched. He threw his arms up over his face as if expecting a physical blow. He let out a low, ragged gasp. Martha did not strike him. She didn't have to. She simply sighed, a sound full of theatrical pity, and looked at Nora. "Look at him. A beast," Martha said softly. "The grief broke his mind. He was always a brute. But my poor sister, she tried to tame him. She tried to love a monster, and it killed her." Martha reached into the pocket of her black wool coat. She pulled out a small leather-bound book. The diary. At the sight of the book, Elias let out a sharp cry. He pressed his hands over his ears, burying his head between his knees. Martha smiled. It was a micro-expression, gone in a fraction of a second, but Nora saw it. Nora saw the absolute calculating pleasure of a predator who knows its prey is trapped. "She wrote everything down," Martha whispered, stepping closer to the cowering giant. "Every dark thought, every terror she felt living with you." Martha opened the book. She didn't read loudly. She kept her voice at a soft, venomous hum. "He frightens me," Martha read. "His hands are too heavy. His temper is too dark. I fear I will not survive the winter in this awful place with him." Elias sobbed. It was a horrific sound coming from a man of his size. It was the sound of a spirit fracturing into dust. He clawed at his own hair. Martha snapped the book shut. She placed it gently, meticulously, on a wooden stool just inches from Elias's feet, a monument to his guilt. She turned back to Nora, smoothing the front of her dress. "These are the rules, Baker," Martha said, her voice dropping all pretense of pity. The tone was iron. "You are here to drop the slop. You may sweep the front floor so the rats do not breed. You will not speak to him. He does not understand words anymore. Do not look him in the eye. It provokes his violent urges." Martha walked toward the door, pulling a thick, fur-lined glove onto her delicate hand. "Leave the food. Clean the dirt. Do not touch anything on his desk," she ordered. "He will be removed to the state asylum in 2 weeks, once the final papers clear the magistrate. Until then, do not make trouble. The town has already forgiven your debts once. Do not test their charity." Martha stepped out into the freezing light. The buggy springs groaned as she climbed in. The horse trotted away, the sound fading into the winter silence. Nora stood perfectly still. She looked at the cowering giant. She looked at the diary placed precisely on the stool. She looked at the bucket of slop in her hand. Martha had given her rules. Martha had assumed Nora was broken enough to follow them. Nora walked over to the wooden stool. Elias tensed, bracing for her to shout, to strike him, to read the book. Nora did not look at the book. She set the bucket of slop down. She turned around and surveyed the forge. Dirt was a choice. Chaos was a state of mind. Nora had lost her bakery, she had lost her livelihood, but she had not lost her hands. She walked to the far wall. A heavy iron shovel leaned against the brick covered in cobwebs. Nora grabbed the handle. It was heavy. It felt solid. It felt like reality. She walked to the great stone hearth. It was filled with 3 years of dead gray ash, a mountain of cold waste. Nora drove the shovel into the ash. Scrape. The sound was sharp. It echoed loudly in the cavernous room. Elias flinched. He peeked through his fingers. Nora ignored him. She drove the shovel in again. She lifted a heavy load of ash and carried it to the rusted metal bin by the door. She dumped it. The ash rose in a gray cloud. She went back to the hearth. Scrape, lift, walk, dump. She established a rhythm. The rhythm of physical labor. It was a language Nora understood intimately. It was the same rhythm as kneading heavy dough. Press, fold, turn, dig, lift, walk. For an hour, the only sound in the dead forge was the scrape of iron against stone and the heavy breathing of the aging baker. Her joints throbbed. The cold air burned her lungs. She did not stop. Stopping meant thinking about the empty floorboards under the livery stables. Stopping meant thinking about Mr. Vance. She cleared the hearth completely. She scrubbed the black stone with a piece of rough burlap until her knuckles bled a thin, watery red. Then she walked out the back door. A large woodpile sat buried under the snow. The logs were thick, frozen oak. A heavy splitting axe was buried in a stump. Nora grabbed the handle. She was not a lumberjack. She was a woman in her late 50s, stiff with cold, but she knew leverage. She knew how to drop her weight. She swung the axe. The blade bit into the frozen oak with a loud thwack. It didn't split. She pulled it loose, raised it, and swung again. On the fourth strike, the wood splintered open, revealing the dry, pale grain inside. She chopped for another hour. Her thin shawl was soaked with sweat. Her muscles screamed in protest. She ignored them. The physical pain was grounding. It pushed the cold out of her blood. She carried armfuls of dry oak into the forge. She built a teepee of kindling in the freshly cleaned hearth. She found a rusted flint box on the anvil block. She struck the steel against the stone. A spark flew. It died in the cold. She struck it again. Another spark. On the 10th strike, a spark caught the dry tinder. A tiny ribbon of gray smoke curled upward. Nora blew gently. The flame grew. It caught the kindling. It licked at the heavy oak logs. The wood popped. Fire. For the first time in 3 years, light danced on the walls of the black forge. The sharp, clean smell of burning oak pushed back the stench of rot. Heat began to radiate outward, a physical boundary against the winter. Nora did not smile. She stood up, wiping the soot from her forehead with the back of her bleeding hand. She walked over to Elias. He was staring at the fire. The flames reflected in his hollow eyes. The violent trembling had slowed. Nora picked up the bucket of slop. She walked to the open back door and dumped the entire contents into the snow. She turned back to Elias. "I don't serve garbage," Nora said. Nora did not return to the freezing void beneath the livery stable. She stayed in the forge. She claimed a small space near the hearth, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders. She did not sleep immediately. She watched the fire. She fed it thick pieces of oak every hour, ensuring the coals remained a glowing, steady red. In the corner, Elias watched the flames. The violent trembling had subsided into a dull, rhythmic rock. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the heat. Morning came. The gray light filtered through the cracks in the heavy shutters. Nora stood. Her joints popped, stiff from sleeping on the packed dirt, but the cold was no longer in her marrow. She walked out the door and headed into town. She found the sheriff by the jailhouse. He held out the wooden bucket of slop. Nora did not take it. She held out her hand. "The copper," she said. The sheriff frowned. "Martha paid for you to deliver the food." "I am delivering food. Give me the coin." The sheriff dropped the single copper coin into her scarred palm. Nora turned away. She walked to the back alley of Mr. Vance's grain store, the man who had stolen her bakery. She did not look at the pristine glass windows. She went to the loading dock. A young dock worker was sweeping spilled grain from the wooden planks, cracked wheat, coarse rye, and oats that had fallen from split sacks, floor sweepings, usually meant for the pigs. Nora placed the copper coin on a barrel. She picked up an empty burlap sack. She knelt on the rough planks and used her hands to scoop the sweepings into her bag. The dock worker stared, but the copper coin was shiny, and he said nothing. She walked to the town pump. She filled a dented metal jug with freezing clear water. She walked back to the forge. Elias was exactly where she had left him. The fire had burned down to embers. Nora set to work. This was her domain. She found a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven buried under a pile of rusted horseshoes. It was coated in years of grease and dirt. She took it outside into the snow. She scrubbed it with coarse sand and freezing water until the black iron gleamed dull and clean. She brought it inside and set it near the embers to dry. She needed a clean surface. The massive iron anvil in the center of the room was the only thing tall enough. Nora fetched a bucket of snow. She melted it in a tin cup over the fire. She used her rough burlap cloth and the boiling water to scrub the face of the anvil. She scrubbed until the rusted blood of 1,000 forged horseshoes was gone. The flat, polished steel shone in the firelight. It was no longer a tool of war. It was a baker's table. She poured the floor sweepings onto the anvil. She picked through the pile with meticulous, calloused fingers, removing tiny pebbles, splinters of wood, and dirt. It took an hour. She did not rush. Patience was the foundation of bread. She made a mound of the coarse, dark flour. She used her fingers to form a crater in the center. She poured in the fresh water. Then she began to knead, press, fold, turn. The dough was heavy. It was dense with rye and cracked wheat. It fought against her hands. Nora used the weight of her shoulders, leaning into the hard steel of the anvil. Press, fold, turn. The physical exertion forced the blood to pump hard through her veins. A sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. The rhythmic thud of her knuckles hitting the dough echoed in the cavernous room. It sounded like a heartbeat. In the corner, Elias's rocking slowed. He lifted his head. His matted hair fell away from his eyes. He watched the woman at the anvil. He watched the aggressive, purposeful movement of her hands. It was the first time in 3 years he had seen anything in this room created rather than destroyed. Nora did not look at him. She worked the dough until it was smooth and elastic. She formed it into a tight, round boule. She dusted the bottom of the clean cast-iron pot with a pinch of rye, placed the dough inside, and set the heavy lid on top. She used the iron shovel to scrape the red-hot coals into a circle on the hearth. She placed the pot in the center and shoveled more coals onto the lid. Now they waited. The forge grew quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of anticipation. An hour passed, then the smell began to rise. It started faint, a warm, earthy scent that cut through the lingering smell of damp stone. Then it grew stronger. The rich, heavy aroma of baking bread filled the air. It smelled like harvest. It smelled like life. Elias stopped rocking completely. His nostrils flared. His massive chest expanded as he took a deep, shuddering breath. The scent bypassed the fractured, terrified parts of his mind and struck deep into the primal core of his memory. It was the smell of a home. Nora used a pair of rusted tongs to lift the Dutch oven out of the coals. She used her thick apron to lift the lid. A thick cloud of steam billowed out. Inside sat a dark, crusty loaf of rustic bread. She tipped the pot, letting the hot loaf fall onto the clean anvil. The crust crackled. It was a beautiful sound. Nora did not have a knife. She used her hands. She gripped the hot loaf and pulled it apart. The steam rushed upward, carrying the intense, savory heat of the grain. She tore off a large, jagged half. She walked over to the corner. Elias shrank back slightly, his eyes darting to the diary on the stool. Nora did not look at the diary. She looked at the empty space beside it. She placed the steaming half-loaf directly on the wooden seat, deliberately pushing the leather-bound book an inch to the left to make room. She didn't say a word. She walked back to the anvil, broke off a piece of her own half, and sat on a wooden crate by the fire. She chewed slowly. The bread was dense, tough, and tasted faintly of ash. It was the best thing she had eaten in weeks. In the corner, Elias stared at the bread. The steam curled up, warming his frozen face. His stomach let out a loud, hollow rumble. His hand, thick with grime and trembling violently, reached out. He hesitated, his eyes darting to Nora. She was looking at the fire, chewing her food. She was not watching him. She was not judging him. He grabbed the bread. It was hot enough to burn his fingers, but he didn't care. He brought it to his mouth and took a massive bite. He groaned. It was a sound of absolute desperate relief. He ate the entire half-loaf in less than a minute, swallowing large, unchewed chunks. When it was gone, he licked the rough crumbs from his filthy fingers. For the first time in 3 years, Elias lay down. He did not curl into a tight ball of terror. He stretched his massive legs out toward the fire, closed his eyes, and slept. Nora watched him breathe. The shallow, jagged gasps were gone. His chest rose and fell in a deep, steady rhythm. The arrangement was forced, but the sanctuary was built. For the next 2 weeks, this was their world. The town outside forgot about them, assuming the monster and the disgraced baker were freezing to death in the dirt. Martha did not visit. She was busy finalizing the asylum papers and interviewing buyers for the heavy iron tools. Inside the forge, a silent ecosystem thrived. Nora chopped the wood. She hauled the water. She scrubbed the floors. Every morning she walked into town, took the copper coin, bought floor sweepings, and baked. The rhythmic strike of the axe, the scrape of the shovel, the heavy thud of dough on the anvil. It was a language of labor. Nora spoke it fluently, and Elias listened. He began to emerge from the corner. At first it was just a few feet. He would sit closer to the hearth, warming his massive hands by the flames. Then he began to follow the movements of her hands. One afternoon, Nora was struggling to lift a particularly thick, knotty piece of oak onto the chopping block. Her shoulders ached, and her grip slipped. The log crashed into the snow. She sighed, wiping her forehead, preparing to try again. A massive shadow fell over her. Elias stood beside her. He smelled of wood smoke and sweat. He did not look at her face. He looked at the log. He reached down with one hand. He picked up the heavy oak log as if it were a dry twig and placed it dead center on the chopping block. Then he turned and walked silently back into the forge, sitting down by the fire. Nora stood in the snow. She looked at the log. She looked at the open door of the forge. He was not a beast. He was a man buried alive under an avalanche of lies, and Nora was going to dig him out. The forced arrangement had ended. The slow burn trust had begun. The body heals faster than the mind. By the end of the 3rd week, the physical starvation was gone. Elias's massive frame had begun to fill out again. The thick layer of gray pallor had faded from his skin, replaced by the natural ruddy flush of a working man. He chopped wood every morning. He hauled the heavy water buckets without being asked. He even took the rusted iron shovel and cleared the heavy snowdrifts from the front of the forge. But the mind remained chained. The diary was the chain. It sat perfectly centered on the wooden stool where Martha had left it. Elias never touched it, but he never stopped watching it. Whenever he walked past the stool, his broad shoulders hunched, his chin tucked into his chest, and his eyes darted away, as if the small leather book were a coiled rattlesnake preparing to strike. When the wind howled fiercely at night, Elias would retreat to his corner, pull his knees up and stare at the book, the violent tremors returning to his hands. He was strong enough to break an oak log with a single swing of the axe, but he was completely broken by the ink on those pages. Nora observed this. She watched the mechanics of his fear. She did not pity him. Pity was useless. Pity did not fix a broken wagon wheel, and it did not heal a broken man. She needed to understand the design of his cage. On a Tuesday, the wind died down. The forge was warm. Elias was outside, splitting kindling in the snow. Nora was inside, cleaning the abandoned pantry shelves. She needed more room for the sacks of rye and wheat she bought from the dock worker. She wiped away thick layers of dust and spider webs. On the very top shelf, pushed far into the dark corner, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it down. It was a small, rusted tin box. She opened the lid. The hinges snapped sharply. Inside was a small cloth sack of hardened rock salt, a dried piece of vanilla bean, and a folded square of heavy parchment paper. Nora unfolded the paper. It was a recipe. Sweet honey bread. It was not the ingredients that caught Nora's eye, it was the ink. The handwriting was faded, written years ago, but the strokes were distinct. The letters were soft, round. The loops on the H and the B were wide and gentle. The ink flowed evenly across the parchment, indicating a relaxed, steady hand. At the bottom, a small note was written, "For my Elias, add extra honey. He works so hard." Nora stared at the looping, gentle E. She lowered the parchment. She turned her head and looked across the room at the wooden stool. The diary sat there, casting a small, dark shadow in the firelight. Nora walked over to the stool. She did not ask permission. She picked up the leather-bound book. She opened it to the page Martha had read aloud, the page that detailed the wife's supposed terror. Nora held the diary in her left hand. She held the recipe card in her right. She held them up to the light of the fire. She compared the ink. The handwriting in the diary was entirely different. It was sharp, jagged. The letters leaned aggressively to the right. The E in Elias's name was not a gentle loop. It was composed of hard, slashing lines. The pen had been pressed so deeply into the paper that the nib had nearly torn through the page on the downward strokes. It was the handwriting of a person driven by cold, tightly coiled pressure. It was not the handwriting of a loving, gentle wife. It was the handwriting of a woman who wore expensive black wool and demanded the town starve a man to death. It was a forgery. Nora did not gasp. She did not drop the books. The realization settled into her bones like cold iron. Elias was not insane. He was not a monster. He was a loyal, grieving man who had been systematically destroyed by the one person he trusted to tell him the truth. Martha had weaponized his grief. She had rewritten the memory of his marriage to break his spirit, rendering him catatonic so she could steal his property and sell him to an asylum. It was a murder of the mind, and it was perfectly executed. Nora closed the diary. She placed it back on the stool exactly as it had been. She remembered Martha's strict rules on the day of her visit. Leave the food. Clean the dirt. Do not touch anything on his desk. Rules laid down by a liar were not rules. They were maps to the truth. Nora walked to the massive oak desk in the far corner of the forge. It was covered in dust, old horseshoes, and leather scraps. Elias never went near it. It was his old workspace, abandoned since the day his wife died. Nora set the recipe card down. She began to clear the desk. She moved the heavy iron tools, her hands steady. She opened the top drawer. Empty. She opened the middle drawer. Dust and a broken compass. She opened the bottom drawer. It held old ledgers, the paper yellowed and damp. She pulled the bottom drawer all the way out and set it on the floor. She knelt down and reached into the dark, empty cavity of the desk. She felt the wooden backing. She pressed her fingers against the wood. It gave way slightly, a false panel. Nora wedged her calloused fingers into the thin gap. She pulled. The panel snapped loose with a crack of dry wood. Behind the panel, sitting in the hollow space between the desk's back and the wall, was a small iron strongbox. She pulled it out. It was heavy. A thick brass padlock held it shut. Nora did not look for a key. She knew Martha had it, likely hidden in her pristine black coat. Nora stood up. She carried the iron box to the center of the room. She placed it flat on the massive steel anvil. She walked to the wall of tools. She selected a heavy, short-handled masonry hammer and a thick, sharp steel chisel. She returned to the anvil. She placed the sharp edge of the chisel directly into the mechanism of the brass padlock. She raised the heavy hammer. Clang! The strike rang out like a gunshot in the quiet forge. The brass dented. Outside, the sound of the axe hitting the woodblock stopped instantly. Elias heard the anvil ring. Nora did not hesitate. She raised the hammer again. Clang! The brass casing cracked. Clang! The lock shattered, the heavy shackle springing open with a metallic snap. The door of the forge creaked open. Elias stood in the frame. He held the splitting axe in his right hand. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. He looked at Nora. He looked at the hammer in her hand. He looked at the anvil. He had not heard the anvil ring in 3 years. Nora ignored him. She set the hammer down. She used her thumbs to push the lid of the iron box open. Inside lay 3 thick stacks of letters. They were bound with faded blue ribbons. The paper was worn at the edges, soft from being handled countless times. They smelled faintly of dried lavender, not the damp rot of the forge. Nora picked up the first stack. She slipped the blue ribbon off. She unfolded the top letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Soft, round, sweeping loops. The exact same handwriting as the recipe card. She read the first line silently. My dearest Elias, the doctor says the fever is worsening, but I am not afraid, because you are sitting outside my door. You are the strongest, most gentle man God ever put on this earth, and being your wife is the only heaven I will ever need. Nora closed her eyes. The depth of the love in the ink was overwhelming. It was the absolute antithesis of the venomous, forged diary on the stool. Martha had found these letters after the death. She had hidden them in the desk, and she had replaced them with a weapon. Nora opened her eyes. She looked at Elias. He was still standing by the door. He was staring at the letters in her hand. The violent tremor returned to his fingers. He dropped the axe. It fell into the dirt with a dull thud. He took a step backward, his eyes wide with rising panic, his breath hitching in his throat. He thought she was holding more pain. He thought she was going to read more hatred to him. He began to retreat toward his corner. Stop, Nora said. Her voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was an anchor dropped in deep water. Elias froze. He did not look at her. He looked at the floor, his massive shoulders trembling. Nora did not walk toward him. She did not crowd him. She stepped away from the anvil. She walked to the center of the room, right in front of the warm hearth. She sat down on the packed dirt floor. She crossed her legs. She smoothed her flour-stained skirt. She placed the stack of letters in her lap. She patted the dirt directly across from her. Sit, she said. Elias did not move. The panic in his chest was visible, making his breathing erratic and shallow. Nora did not repeat the command. She waited. She breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She established a slow, deliberate rhythm, a physical metronome in the quiet room. She watched Elias's chest. She timed her own breathing to match his erratic gasps. Then she began to deliberately slow her breath down. Deep, long intakes, heavy, complete exhales. It was the silent language of survival. Elias's eyes flicked to her. He saw the older woman sitting in the dirt. She was not holding a whip. She was not wearing expensive black wool. She was covered in flour and soot. She was just like him. Slowly, painfully, Elias took a step forward, then another. He reached the hearth. He lowered his massive frame down onto the dirt, sitting directly across from her. He pulled his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible, bracing for the verbal blows. He squeezed his eyes shut. Nora did not preach. She did not tell him he had been lied to. Words were cheap. She needed to give him proof. She unfolded the first letter. She looked at the cowering giant. "Listen," she commanded softly, and then, in the quiet warmth of the firelight, Nora began to read. "My dearest Elias," Nora read. Her voice was not soft. It was the rough, gravelly sound of a woman who had worked her whole life, but it was steady. It was absolute. Elias flinched at the sound of his name. He pressed his palms harder against his ears. He was bracing for the poison. He was waiting to be told he was a monster. Nora did not stop. "The doctor says the fever is worsening, but I am not afraid, because you are sitting outside my door. You are the strongest, most gentle man God ever put on this earth, and being your wife is the only heaven I will ever need." Elias's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet room. He squeezed his eyes tighter. He was trying to block it out. The cognitive dissonance was a physical pain in his skull. This was not what the Black Book said. The Black Book said she hated him. The Black Book said she feared his heavy hands. Nora turned the page. She did not raise her voice. She simply maintained the rhythm. "I hear you pacing in the hall, my love. Your footsteps are heavy. They shake the floorboards. To anyone else it might sound like thunder. To me, it sounds like a fortress. It sounds like a man who would tear the sky apart to keep the rain from touching me." Elias stopped rocking. His massive shoulders went completely still. The words were not an attack. They were a key turning in a rusted lock. "Martha came today," Nora read. The mention of the sister's name made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. "She told me to send you away to work. She said the smell of the forge on your skin was unseemly for a sick room. I told her the smell of your sweat was the smell of honest labor. I told her I would rather breathe the smoke of your fire than the expensive perfume she wears. She looked at me with such cold eyes, Elias. She does not understand us. She only understands what things cost." Slowly, agonizingly, Elias lowered his hands from his ears. He opened his eyes. They were wide, raw. He stared at the piece of parchment in Nora's hands. "If this fever takes me," Nora read, her voice dropping into a deeper, resonant timbre, "do not let the fire in the forge die. Do not let the silence take you. You are a creator, Elias. You take cold, dead iron, and you give it purpose. Promise me you will not become cold. Promise me you will remember how much I loved the warmth of your hands." Nora stopped reading. She folded the letter. She placed it carefully on top of the stack in her lap. The silence in the forge was profound. It was not the oppressive, terrifying silence of the past 3 years. It was the breathless silence of a collapsed lung taking its first desperate intake of air. Elias sat frozen in the dirt. He was looking at the letters. He did not wail. He did not scream. The pain he had endured was too deep for noise. Instead, a single violent shudder tore through his massive frame. It started in his boots and traveled up his spine. His chest heaved once, then again. A single tear broke loose. It fell from his left eye, cutting a clean, pale line through the thick layer of soot and grime on his cheek. It fell into his tangled beard. Then another. He wept in absolute silence. The dam had broken. The manufactured guilt, the crushing weight of believing he had tortured the woman he loved, the psychological cage Martha had built with her elegant, poisoned pen, it all shattered into a million jagged pieces on the packed dirt floor. Nora did not reach out to comfort him. She did not pat his shoulder. To offer physical comfort now would be an insult to the magnitude of his realization. He needed to feel the clean pain of truth, not the muddy comfort of pity. She sat perfectly still, holding the letters. She was the anvil. He was the hammer striking it. After 10 minutes, the silent weeping stopped. Elias wiped his face with the back of his massive, calloused hand. He took a deep breath. It was the deepest breath he had taken since his wife's funeral. His chest expanded, stretching the dirty wool of his shirt. He looked at Nora. His eyes were no longer hollow. The empty void was gone. In its place was a sharp, hyper-focused clarity. The feral beast the town feared had vanished. The man had returned. He extended his right hand toward her. It was shaking, but not from fear. It was shaking from adrenaline. Nora did not hand him the stack. She handed him the single letter she had just read. Elias took it. His thick, clumsy fingers held the delicate parchment as if it were spun glass. He lowered his head. He looked at the ink. He recognized the gentle curves. He recognized the wide loop of the E. He remembered watching her write at the small kitchen table, her hand moving smoothly across the paper. He stared at the letter for a long time. Then he slowly turned his head. He looked across the forge. He looked at the wooden stool. The black leather diary sat there, casting its small shadow. Elias stood up. He was 6 feet and 5 inches of solid muscle. When he stood to his full height, he blocked the light from the fire. The shadow he cast across the room was immense. He walked to the stool. His footsteps were heavy. They shook the floorboards. They sounded like a fortress. He stopped in front of the stool. He looked down at the black book. For 3 years it had been his executioner. He had cowered before it. He had starved himself because of it. He did not touch it. He did not throw it into the fire. Destroying it would be a reaction of panic. Instead, he reached out with one finger and pushed the diary a single inch to the right. Just as Nora had done with the bread, he was moving it out of the center of his life. He turned back to Nora. She was still sitting on the floor. She watched him with steady, evaluating eyes. Elias walked back to her. He didn't sit down. He stood over her, looking down at the disgraced, aging baker who had walked into a tomb with a bucket of slop and chosen to build a fire instead. He opened his mouth. His jaw cracked, stiff from years of disuse. His throat worked silently for a moment, the vocal cords fighting against the atrophy. When he spoke, his voice was low. It was a deep, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding against each other at the bottom of a river. She lied. 2 words. They were the first words he had spoken in over 1,000 days. Nora looked up at him. She did not smile. She simply nodded once. Yes, Nora said, she lied. Elias looked at the stack of letters in Nora's lap. He looked at the shattered iron strongbox on the anvil. He looked at the heavy masonry hammer. He understood the mechanics of the betrayal. Martha had hidden the truth in the dark and placed the lie in the light. She had weaponized his inability to face his wife's things against him. She had turned his own home into an asylum. The grief was still there. The loss of his wife would always be an open wound, but the guilt was gone. And in the void left by the guilt, something else began to pour in. It was cold. It was heavy. It was absolute. It was anger, but it was not the chaotic, blind rage of a madman. It was the focused, terrifying anger of a craftsman who realizes his tools have been used to build a prison. It was the anger of a blacksmith preparing to strike the iron while it was white hot. He looked at Nora again. "When?" Elias asked. His voice was stronger this time. The gravel was smoothing out. Nora understood the question. "When is she coming back to finish me?" Nora stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She walked over to the anvil and placed the stack of real letters safely inside the cast-iron Dutch oven, out of the damp air. She picked up the forged diary from the stool and placed it right beside the heavy steel chisel. 2 weeks, Nora said, turning to face him. She told the sheriff the asylum papers will be finalized in 2 weeks. They will come for you then. Elias looked at the heavy timber doors. He looked at the walls of his forge. He walked over to the corner where his heavy leather apron hung on a rusted nail. It was stiff and coated in dust. He pulled it down. He shook at once, a massive cloud of dust rising into the air. He slipped it over his head and tied the thick leather straps behind his back. He walked to the wall of tools. He reached past the masonry hammer. He reached past the tongs. He grabbed the handle of his primary forging hammer. It weighed 12 pounds. The handle was dark hickory, shaped perfectly to his grip. He pulled it off the wall. He gripped it tightly. The muscles in his massive forearm bunched and corded like heavy rope. He walked to the anvil. He set the hammer down on the steel face. Clack. The sound was solid. It was the sound of a man claiming his space. "Let them come," Elias said. He didn't yell it. He stated it as a physical fact, a law of gravity. Nora looked at the giant. She looked at the hammer. She looked at the fire burning steadily in the hearth. She walked over to the pile of floor sweepings she had brought from the grain store. She rolled up her sleeves, exposing her flour-stained arms. She grabbed the heavy wooden bucket and headed for the door to fetch more snow. "We need more wood," Nora said without looking back. "If they are coming, the fire needs to be hot." Elias looked at her back. A slow, nearly imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. He was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. He was a man standing in his own fortress, and the baker was his garrison. He didn't say a word. He walked to the back door, grabbed the splitting axe, and stepped out into the freezing wind. The sound of the axe biting into the frozen oak rang out across the dead yard. It was rhythmic. It was powerful. The slow-burn trust was sealed, not with hugs, not with tears, but with the shared preparation for war. Above the forge, the sky darkened. The heavy gray clouds of a massive winter storm began to roll in over the valley. The external storm was gathering, mirroring the inevitable collision that was about to take place within these stone walls. Martha thought she was returning to collect a broken animal. She had no idea she was walking into a furnace. 2 weeks is enough time to forge a blade. It is also enough time to forge a man. The 14 days passed in a rhythm of relentless, quiet labor. Elias did not speak much. The single "let them come" was the only vow he needed to make. He channeled his rage into the iron. He fired the forge until the stones glowed a dull, angry red. He took the rusted, twisted scrap metal from the yard, heated it until it was blindingly white, and beat it back into shape. He was not making horseshoes or plows. He was reclaiming his territory. He was remembering the weight of his own strength. Nora baked. She kept the pantry full. She kept the water bucket from freezing. She did not ask him how he felt. She did not hover. She simply ensured that when he set down his heavy hammer, there was hot bread and strong tea waiting for him. They moved around each other with the synchronized efficiency of 2 gears in a heavy machine. On the morning of the 14th day, the sky did not lighten. It turned the color of a bruised iron plate. The blizzard hit an hour after dawn. It was not a gentle snowfall. It was a horizontal wall of blinding white ice, driven by a wind that shrieked through the pines. The temperature plummeted so fast the glass in the town's windows cracked. The roads disappeared. The world was reduced to the space a person could see when they held their hand in front of their face. Inside the forge, the heat was a physical barrier against the storm. Elias had built the fire high. He stood at the anvil wearing his thick leather apron over a clean, heavy wool shirt. The thick layers of grime were gone from his face. His beard was trimmed. His massive arms swung the hammer with a steady, deafening rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. Nora sat by the hearth, sorting dried beans into a tin pot. The air smelled of roasting coffee and wood smoke. Then the rhythm was broken. Through the howling wind, a different sound cut through. The heavy, grinding crunch of large, iron-rimmed wheels breaking through deep ice. The snort of exhausted, freezing horses. Elias stopped mid-swing. He rested the heavy hammer on the face of the anvil. He looked at the heavy timber doors. He looked at Nora. Nora did not drop her tin pot. She set it down smoothly on the packed dirt. She stood up, wiping her hands on her flour-stained apron. She walked over to the wooden stool and picked up the black forged diary. She placed it squarely in the center of the massive oak desk. She did the same with the rusted iron lockbox. She walked back to her place by the hearth and stood perfectly still. Outside, heavy boots hit the wooden planks of the porch. The heavy iron latch rattled violently. Someone was trying to force it open. Elias had dropped the thick interior oak bar across the double doors that morning. "Open the door in the name of the magistrate!" a muffled voice shouted through the thick wood. It was the sheriff. Elias did not move to open it. He reached out and lifted the heavy hickory handle of his 12-pound forging hammer. He held it casually in his right hand. He nodded to Nora. Nora walked to the doors. She lifted the heavy oak bar. The doors burst open with explosive force. The wind howled into the room, bringing a cloud of blinding white snow. But the wind was instantly met by the wall of roaring heat from the forge. The snow melted into rain before it even hit the dirt floor. 4 figures stood in the doorway. The sheriff entered first, his hand resting on the leather grip of his revolver. He was freezing, his mustache caked with ice. Behind him stepped 2 massive, thick-necked orderlies from the state asylum. They wore heavy gray coats. One of them held a thick coil of iron chains and heavy wrist cuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the doorway. And finally, Martha stepped in. She was wrapped in an expensive, thick, black bear fur coat. A heavy black veil protected her face from the ice. She pulled the veil back. Her eyes scanned the room, expecting to find the freezing, rotting tomb she had left 2 weeks ago. She stopped. Her sharp eyes darted across the room. The floor was swept clean of debris. The massive iron tools were hung precisely on the walls, oiled and gleaming. The air smelled of fresh coffee and hot bread, not rot and urine. The fire in the hearth was a roaring, brilliant orange. Martha's jaw tightened. This was not the scene of a dying animal. This was a home. She stepped further into the room, her polished leather boots stepping onto the dry dirt. The 2 orderlies flanked her, raising the iron chains. The sheriff stepped to the side, looking uncomfortable in the intense heat of the forge. Martha's eyes found Nora. The older woman stood calmly by the hearth. She was not cowering. She was not trembling. She looked at Martha the way one looks at a rat in a flour barrel, with cold, clinical disgust. Martha's upper lip curled into a sneer. She reached into her thick fur coat and pulled out a roll of heavy legal parchment. The magistrate's seal was stamped at the bottom in dark red wax. "I see the town's charity has been wasted," Martha said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "You were hired to feed a beast, Baker, not play house in my property. Get your things. You're leaving." Nora did not move. She did not speak. Martha's eyes flashed with genuine anger. She was not used to being ignored by the lower class. She turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff, remove this vagrant from my property," Martha ordered. "She is trespassing. Her contract ended yesterday." The sheriff cleared his throat, pulling his collar up against the draft. "Nora, you need to step outside. We have official county business here. The asylum transfer is signed." "She will freeze to death in this storm," Elias's voice rumbled. It was the first time they heard him speak. The sound was so deep, so unexpectedly calm, that all 4 intruders froze. They looked toward the shadows near the anvil. Elias had been standing perfectly still, his massive frame blending into the dark iron of the forge. He stepped forward into the orange light of the fire. The sheriff took a physical step backward. The orderlies tightened their grip on the iron chains. They expected to see the hunched, trembling, emaciated giant who cowered at shadows. They expected a man broken by madness. Instead, they saw a titan. Elias stood at his full 6'5" height. His broad shoulders blocked the light. His chest was expansive, breathing deeply and evenly. He held the 12-pound hammer in his right hand as easily as a man holds a walking stick. His eyes were not hollow. They were locked onto Martha, burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. Martha's breath hitched. A flicker of genuine panic crossed her perfectly composed face. She recognized that look. It was the look of a man who knew exactly who he was, but she was arrogant. She had the law on her side. She rallied her composure, gripping the legal parchment tighter. "He is having a lucid moment," Martha said quickly, her voice slightly higher than before. She gestured sharply to the orderlies. "It makes him dangerous. Restrain him immediately. Put the chains on him before he becomes violent." The two large orderlies stepped forward. They were big men, used to wrestling uncooperative patients to the floor. But as they looked up at the sheer mass of the blacksmith, their steps faltered. "Step away from the anvil, Elias," the first orderly said, his voice lacking conviction. He rattled the heavy iron cuffs. "Make it easy on yourself." Elias did not look at the orderlies. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on Martha. "You do not own this forge," Elias stated. His voice did not raise in volume. It simply filled the room, vibrating against the stone walls. Martha let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It sounded brittle. She unrolled the parchment and held it up. "I have the magistrate's signature right here, you broken brute," Martha spat, dropping the veil of the grieving sister entirely. The venom in her voice was absolute. "You are declared legally incompetent, a danger to yourself and the public. The estate defaults to me as the closest sane relative. You are going to a padded cell in the state hospital, and you will die there." She pointed a gloved finger at Nora. "And you. You will walk out into that blizzard, and when they find your frozen body in the spring, I will make sure they bury you in the pauper's ditch." Martha looked back at the sheriff. "Do your job. Arrest the vagrant and chain the beast." The sheriff drew his revolver. He aimed it at Elias's chest. His hand was shaking slightly. "Elias," the sheriff said, his voice tight, "put the hammer down. I don't want to shoot you, son, but I have a lawful order. Put it down." The two orderlies stepped closer, raising the heavy chains. The external storm was howling at their backs. The internal storm was about to break. The division was set. The antagonist had laid all her cards on the table, backed by the guns and chains of the law. Elias looked at the barrel of the revolver. He looked at the heavy iron chains. He did not raise his hammer. He did not roar. He did not attack. Violence was the weapon of the desperate. Elias was not desperate. He was the owner of the anvil. He slowly lowered the 12-pound hammer. He rested the heavy steel head gently on the packed dirt floor. He let go of the handle. Martha smiled, a triumphant, cruel smirk. She thought he had surrendered. She thought the sight of the gun had broken him again. "Good boy," Martha mocked. "Put the cuffs on him." The orderlies lunged forward with the chains. "No." The word did not come from Elias. It came from Nora. The older woman stepped out from the hearth. She walked directly between the massive blacksmith and the two orderlies. She did not have a weapon. She only had her flour-stained apron and her scarred hands. She stopped in the center of the room. She looked at the sheriff. She looked at the orderlies. Then she turned her eyes to Martha. "He is not going anywhere," Nora said. Her voice was flat, carrying the unyielding weight of an iron plate. "He is not mad. He is not a beast." Nora pointed a calloused, crooked finger directly at the woman in the expensive black fur. "You are the only monster in this room, Martha." Martha's face contorted. The mask of the grieving, aristocratic sister slipped entirely, revealing the ugly, jagged edges of her true nature. "You filthy, flower-covered hag," Martha hissed. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the stone walls. "Sheriff, arrest her. She is interfering with a magistrate's order." The sheriff stepped forward, his boots heavy on the dirt. He reached out to grab Nora's arm. Nora did not flinch. She did not back away. She looked at the sheriff's hand, then looked up into his eyes. "You arrest me? You arrest the only witness to a murder," Nora said flatly. The sheriff stopped. His hand hovered in the air. "Murder? Elias's wife died of a winter fever, Nora. The doctor signed the certificate." "I am not talking about a murder of the flesh," Nora said. She turned her back on the sheriff and the orderlies. She walked slowly, deliberately, to the massive oak desk. Martha's eyes tracked Nora's movements. When she saw the broken iron strongbox sitting on the anvil, her face drained of color. A pale, sickening white washed over her sharp cheekbones. Nora picked up the black leather diary from the desk. She walked back and shoved it squarely against the sheriff's chest. "Open it," Nora commanded. The sheriff blinked, instinctively taking the book. He opened it to a random page. "It's a diary. Martha brought it to the council months ago. We've all seen it." "You looked at the words," Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. "You didn't look at the ink." Nora walked back to the desk. She picked up the faded parchment recipe card. She brought it back to the sheriff and held it up right beside the open diary. "Look at the letters," Nora instructed. "Look at the E in Elias. In the recipe card, it is round, soft. The ink is light. A woman writing about the man she loves." Nora tapped the page of the black diary with her calloused, flour-stained finger. "Now look at the diary. The letters lean hard to the right. The strokes are sharp like a butcher's knife. The pen was pressed so deeply into the paper it nearly tore the page. That is not the handwriting of a dying, frightened woman." Nora turned her head slowly and locked eyes with Martha. "That is the handwriting of a woman filled with jealousy and greed, a woman who wrote in a furious hurry." The sheriff frowned. He held the two pieces of paper closer to the light of the fire. His eyes darted back and forth. The discrepancy was not subtle. It was glaringly obvious once pointed out. He lowered the book. He looked at Martha. "Martha?" the sheriff asked. What is this?" "It's a trick," Martha spat, her voice rising in pitch. She stepped forward, her expensive black fur coat swishing heavily. "The vagrant forged that recipe. She is trying to protect a madman to keep a roof over her head." "I am a baker," Nora said calmly. "My hands are stiff from 30 years of kneading dough. I cannot hold a fine pen." Nora walked back to the massive oak desk for the third time. "But I know who can," Nora said. She reached into the dark, hollow cavity behind the false wooden panel of the desk. Martha had hidden the real letters in the iron box, but the arrogant always leave a trace of their hubris. Nora pulled out a long, narrow mahogany case. It was polished and expensive. Martha gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air. She took a step backward, bumping into one of the massive orderlies. Nora unlatched the brass hooks on the mahogany case and flipped it open. Inside lay 3 heavy, silver-tipped calligraphy pens. Beside them sat a bottle of specialized thick black India ink. And neatly folded in the velvet lid were several crumpled, torn pieces of parchment. Nora pulled the crumpled papers out. She walked over to the sheriff and handed them to him. "Practice drafts," Nora stated. Her voice was cold, striking like a hammer on an anvil. She tried to mimic her sister's soft handwriting. You can see the attempts on the top lines, but she lacked the patience, she lacked the gentleness. So she gave up, used her own sharp script, and filled a black book with lies. She wrote that Elias was a monster. She wrote that he terrified his wife. Then she placed it right at his feet. The sheriff unfolded the crumpled drafts. He saw the exact words from the diary, written first in shaky, attempted loops, then scratched out violently, replaced by the sharp, aggressive slashes. The truth settled over the room like a heavy iron blanket. The sheriff slowly turned his head toward Elias. He looked at the giant standing by the anvil. He remembered the wild, violent rumors. He remembered the cowering, shaking beast the town had feared for 3 years. "He wasn't shaking from madness, Sheriff," Nora said, her voice softening just a fraction, speaking the truth that the entire valley needed to hear. He was shaking because she made him believe he tortured the only thing he ever loved. "You didn't starve his body. You let her starve his soul." The sheriff lowered his revolver. He uncocked the hammer with a soft click. He slid it back into his leather holster. He looked at the 2 orderlies. "Drop the chains," he ordered quietly. The heavy iron cuffs hit the dirt floor with a loud metallic clang. Martha realized her fortress of lies was collapsing. The panic set in. It was a vicious, cornered panic. "You fools!" Martha screamed. She lunged forward, her hands hooked into claws, aiming directly for the letters and drafts in the sheriff's hands. "Give me those! They are mine! It's my property! He is a beast!" She didn't reach the sheriff. A shadow moved across the room. It was not fast, but it was absolute. Elias stepped between the sheriff and Martha. He did not raise his hands to strike her. He did not yell. He simply stood in her path like a mountain of granite and iron. Martha slammed into his chest. She bounced off, stumbling backward in her expensive leather boots. She looked up. Elias was looking down at her. The heat radiating from his massive frame was intense. The cold, clear clarity in his eyes was terrifying. He was not the broken man who had cowered in the corner 2 weeks ago. He was the master of the forge. He was the man who bent steel to his will. Martha froze. The scream died in her throat. Her entire body began to tremble. She was finally looking at the real strength of the man she had tried to destroy, and it terrified her to her core. Elias reached out slowly. His massive, calloused hand dwarfed her entirely. He did not grab her throat. He did not grab her wrists. He reached past her, his thick fingers plucking the heavy legal parchment. The magistrate's asylum order right out of her trembling hand. He looked at the document. He looked at the red wax seal. Then he turned slightly and tossed the parchment directly into the roaring orange flames of the hearth. The paper flared brilliantly for 3 seconds. Then it turned to black ash and floated up the stone chimney. Elias turned back to Martha. The silence in the room was absolute. The howling wind outside seemed to fade into nothingness. He looked at the woman who had forged a psychological prison to steal his life. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the disgraced baker who had walked into the dark and built a fire. He didn't need a monologue. He didn't need to explain his pain. He was a man of physical realities. Elias looked at Martha. "She stays," Elias said, his voice a deep, unyielding rumble that shook the dust from the rafters. He raised his right arm and pointed a massive, soot-stained finger directly at the open double doors, out into the blinding, freezing blizzard. "You leave." The judgment was final. There was no appeal. Martha stared at the thick finger pointing toward the storm. She looked at the sheriff, expecting the law to intervene. The sheriff crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at the broken padlock on the strongbox, the practice drafts in his hand, and the roaring fire. "You heard the man, Martha," the sheriff said. His voice was laced with deep, heavy disgust. "You're trespassing. I suggest you get in your buggy before the roads freeze entirely." Martha's face twisted in ultimate defeat. The pristine facade was gone. She looked small, ugly, and utterly powerless. She pulled her heavy black fur coat tightly around herself. She did not say another word. She turned on her heel and marched out the doors, her boots crunching sharply in the snow. The two orderlies looked at Elias. They looked at the 12-pound hammer resting near his feet. They did not wait for an invitation. They turned and followed Martha out into the storm. The sheriff lingered for a moment. He looked at Nora, then at Elias. "I'll have the magistrate strike the order from the county record by tomorrow morning," the sheriff said quietly. He tipped his hat to Nora. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. The whole town does." Nora did not smile. She did not offer forgiveness. Forgiveness was cheap. "Keep the draft safe, Sheriff," Nora said. "She will try to sell the land she bought with the money she stole from his accounts. You will need the proof." The sheriff nodded grimly. He turned and walked out, pulling the heavy timber doors shut behind him, dropping the iron latch. The storm was locked out. The climax had broken. The truth had not just been spoken, it had been proved, weighed, and measured in ink, paper, and fire. The antagonist was not dead, but she was destroyed in the only way that mattered. Her hypocrisy was exposed to the light. Inside the forge, the heat pulsed steadily. Elias stood in the center of the room. He looked at the closed doors. The tension slowly drained from his massive shoulders. He let out a long, slow breath. The physical weight of 3 years of manufactured guilt lifted from his bones entirely. He turned and looked at Nora. Nora was already walking back to the hearth. She knelt down on the packed dirt. She picked up her tin pot of dried beans and resumed sorting them. She did not wait for a thank you. She did not expect a dramatic confession of gratitude. They were both past the age of fairy tales. They were people of the earth, of fire and of flower. Elias watched her. He watched the steady, rhythmic movement of her scarred hands. He walked over to the anvil. He picked up his 12-pound hammer. He did not hang it back on the wall. He raised it high and brought it down on the glowing red iron waiting on the anvil. Clang. The sound rang out, clear and true. It was the heartbeat of the valley restored to life. The stand was over. The healing could finally begin. The blizzard died before dawn. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a cold, blinding white light across the fresh snow of the valley. In town, the sheriff did not go to his office. He walked directly to the First National Bank. His heavy boots left wet, melting tracks on the polished hardwood floor. He bypassed the teller cages and walked straight into the bank manager's office. He did not say good morning. He placed the crumpled practice drafts and the bottle of specialized Black India ink squarely on the manager's mahogany desk. He placed the late wife's real, soft-looped letters right next to them. The bank manager adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the drafts. He looked at the ink. The sheriff instructed him to pull the ledgers for Elias's estate over the past 3 years. They laid the heavy ledger books open. The withdrawal signatures authorizing the transfer of Elias's funds into Martha's personal accounts were aggressive. The E's were sharp. The strokes were jagged, leaning hard to the right. They were an exact match to the forged diary. They looked nothing like the soft, sweeping loops of the late wife, nor the heavy, block-lettered signature of the blacksmith. It was not just a matter of extreme psychological cruelty. It was wire fraud. It was grand larceny. It was a federal crime. Across town, Martha was in her bedroom. She was not crying. She was moving with frantic, jerky efficiency. She was shoving expensive velvet dresses, a box of pearls, and heavy silver candlesticks into a large leather steamer trunk. Her hands were shaking violently. She knew the sheriff. She knew he would not keep quiet. She needed to be on the 10 a.m. train heading east. The heavy, authoritative knock on her front door echoed through the grand house. Martha froze. She looked at the grandfather clock. It was 8:15 a.m. She walked downstairs, her back straight, attempting to pull the mask of aristocratic indignation back over her face. She opened the door. It wasn't just the sheriff. It was the bank manager, the town magistrate, and 2 armed deputies. There was no dramatic shootout. There was no screaming. The violence of the law in the civilized world is carried out with paper, brass keys, and cold stares. The magistrate handed her a freeze order, effective immediately. The bank manager walked past her and calmly took the silver candlesticks out of her steamer trunk, noting them as stolen assets. The deputies instructed her to step out onto the porch. "You cannot do this," Martha hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "I am a respected member of this community." "You are a thief, Martha," the sheriff said flatly, "and you are broke. The estate is being returned to its rightful owner. You have 10 minutes to pack a single bag of personal clothing. Then you are vacating these premises." 10 minutes later, Martha stood on the frozen boardwalk. She wore her heavy black bear fur coat, but she held only a single small, battered carpet bag. The town had gathered. The rumors had spread rapidly from the orderlies the night before. The sheriff had already pinned the forged drafts to the public notice board outside the jailhouse. The evidence was undeniable. Martha looked at the crowd. She looked for sympathy. She looked for an ally. She saw the preacher, the man who had gladly accepted her heavy tithes and prayed publicly for the mad blacksmith's tortured soul. The preacher did not meet her eye. He looked down at his boots, turned his back, and walked into the church, shutting the heavy oak door. She saw Mr. Vance, the grain merchant. He stood on his loading dock. When Martha looked at him, he stepped back inside his store and turned the brass lock on the glass door. She was no longer the grieving, pious sister. She was a pariah. The town did not throw stones. They did not form a lynch mob. They did something much worse to a woman who craved status. They erased her. They looked through her as if she were a ghost. Martha began to walk toward the train station. Her polished leather boots slipped in the freezing mud. No one offered her a hand when she stumbled. No one offered to carry her heavy bag. She walked into the biting winter wind entirely alone. The freezing, absolute exile she had so carefully designed for Nora was now her own. 5 miles away, at the edge of the winter woods, the air was not silent. Clang, clang, clang. The heavy rhythmic strike of a 12-pound hammer against a steel anvil echoed through the valley. It carried over the massive snowdrifts. It reached the very edge of the town. The men on the boardwalk stopped and listened. They remembered that sound. It was the sound of industry. It was the sound of a man who could bend iron and shape the world around him. It was a heartbeat. They realized, with a heavy wave of collective shame, how foolish they had been to believe a black book over the evidence of their own ears. The giant was awake. Inside the forge, the heat was blinding. Elias stood over the anvil. He was shirtless, his thick leather apron protecting his torso from the shower of bright orange sparks. His muscles bunched and released with mechanical, terrifying precision. He was not repairing old horseshoes. He was forging a massive new set of heavy iron drop hinges for the main double doors. He was fortifying his fortress. Nora was at her station. She had moved the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven away from the main hearth, using old bricks to create a dedicated permanent baking oven in the corner. She was kneading a massive mound of dough. They did not talk about the storm. They did not talk about Martha. The rot had been cut out. There was no need to examine the disease once it was gone. Around noon, a heavy wagon pulled into the snow-covered yard. It was Mr. Vance, the grain merchant. In the back of the wagon sat 400-pound sacks of premium, finely milled white flour. It was an offering of peace, a guilty conscience trying to buy its way out of the cold. Mr. Vance knocked timidly on the heavy timber door. Elias stopped hammering. He rested the hammer on the anvil. He did not go to the door. He looked at Nora. It was her domain. Nora wiped the coarse flour from her hands onto her apron. She walked to the doors and opened one side a fraction. Mr. Vance took off his expensive wool hat. He looked incredibly uncomfortable in the heat of the forge. "Nora," Vance stammered, holding his hat over his chest. I brought some flour, top-grade winter wheat, for the forge, on the house, the town. We want to make things right." Nora looked past him at the fine white flour sacks in the wagon. She looked at the man who had stolen her bakery with fine print and a fake smile. "Take it back," Nora said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Nora, please," Vance pleaded, taking a step closer. "The town feels terrible. We didn't know what Martha was doing." "You knew I was freezing under the floorboards of the livery stable?" Nora said, her eyes boring into him like iron spikes. "You knew he was eating sour slop out of a bucket. Ignorance of a crime is not an excuse for cruelty, Mr. Vance." She placed her hand on the heavy oak door. "Take your flour back. We bake with our own grain." She pushed the heavy door shut. The iron latch dropped with a solid final thud. She walked back to her dough. Elias watched her. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of deep respect passed between them. He raised his hammer again. The boundary was set. They didn't need the town's charity now, just as they hadn't needed its permission to survive. Winter finally broke. It did not leave gently. It surrendered to a brutal, muddy thaw that turned the valley roads into thick brown rivers. The snow slid from the roof of the forge in heavy, wet sheets, crashing onto the thawing earth. Inside, the rhythm of the work never faltered. The town slowly crept back to the edge of the woods. Necessity forced their hand. A broken plowshare could not be fixed by a guilty conscience. It required a master blacksmith. The farmers came first. They parked their wagons at the edge of the yard, walking the rest of the way with their heads bowed. They left their broken iron by the heavy double doors. They did not knock. They did not demand service. They left their payment, silver coins, heavy cuts of cured bacon, jars of wild honey, on the wooden barrel outside. Elias fixed the iron. He did not speak to the farmers. He did not smile at them. He took the broken pieces, heated them in the roaring coals, and beat them back into shape with devastating precision. When the work was done, he left the repaired tools on the barrel. He was not their friend. He was their smith. The boundary was absolute. Nora's routine shifted with the season. She no longer walked into town for the floor sweepings. A farmer from the next county over, a man who owed the town bank nothing, began delivering heavy sacks of premium winter wheat directly to the forge every Tuesday. Nora did not open a new bakery. She did not want a glass window for the town to look through. She baked for the forge. She baked for survival. She baked for Elias. The physical toll of the past 3 years began to fully erase itself from the giant's body. The atrophy was replaced by dense, corded muscle. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a calm, terrifying focus. He was a man in full possession of his strength. On a Tuesday in late April, the mud finally dried. The pale green shoots of spring grass began to push through the dark earth of the yard. Elias did not light the main hearth that morning. Nora noticed the silence. She looked up from her dough. Elias was standing by the water trough. He was stripping off his heavy work shirt. He plunged his head and massive shoulders into the freezing water, washing away the layers of soot and ash. He dried himself with a rough towel. He walked to the corner and put on a clean, heavy wool shirt. He pulled on a dark wool coat that had hung untouched on a peg for 3 years. He did not explain where he was going. He didn't have to. He walked out the door and headed down the 5-mile dirt road toward town. When Elias walked down the center of the main street, the boardwalks went completely silent. The giant had not set foot inside the town limits since the day of his wife's funeral. Men tipped their hats and quickly looked away. Women pulled their children closer to their skirts. They were not looking at a feral beast. They were looking at a living monument to their own hypocrisy. Elias ignored them all. He did not look at the sheriff's office. He did not look at Mr. Vance's grain store. He walked directly into the county magistrate's office. The clerk behind the desk swallowed hard. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat. He pulled out the original heavy parchment deed to the forge and the surrounding 50 acres of timberland. He laid it flat on the clerk's desk. The paper was worn. The ink faded. Elias pointed a massive, calloused finger at the blank space directly beneath his own name. "Add her," Elias commanded. The gravel in his voice was not a request. It was a physical law. The clerk scrambled for his pen. He dipped it into the inkwell, his hand shaking slightly. "Yes, Mr. Elias, of course. And the name?" "Nora." "Last name, sir?" Elias looked at the clerk. The cold, unyielding stare made the clerk's blood run cold. "Just Nora," Elias said. "She doesn't need another name. Write it." The clerk wrote it. He stamped the heavy red wax seal next to it, making it an undeniable legal reality. Half of the forge, half of the land, half of the iron. It was hers. Not by charity, by right. Elias took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his coat. He turned and walked out of the office. He did not stop for a drink. He did not buy provisions. He turned his back on the town and walked home. When he reached the edge of the woods, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat met him. He pushed the heavy double doors open. The forge was warm. The afternoon sun cut through the open shutters, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Nora was at the anvil. She was using a dull, rusted iron scraper to clean the dried dough from the steel face. Her hands were tired, her knuckles swollen from the day's labor. Elias walked over to the anvil. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded legal deed. He placed it squarely on the polished steel, right next to her pile of flour. Nora stopped scraping. She looked at the heavy parchment. She saw the red wax seal. She saw the fresh black ink. Owner, Elias and Nora. She did not gasp. She did not cover her mouth with her hands. She did not cry. Crying was for women who had something left to lose. Nora had just gained the ground beneath her feet. She looked up at the giant. Elias did not offer a dramatic speech. He did not ask her to stay. He did not declare his undying gratitude. Vows made of words could be forged, manipulated, and burned. Elias was a blacksmith. He only trusted things built to last. He reached into his other deep coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy, newly forged tool. It was a dough scraper, but it was not like any tool Nora had ever seen. The blade was made of high-carbon steel, folded and hammered until it was razor-sharp and indestructible. The handle was carved from thick, dark hickory wood, sanded perfectly smooth, and fastened to the steel with heavy brass rivets. It was perfectly balanced. It was heavy. It was a masterpiece of iron and wood designed specifically for her scarred, aging hands. He had spent the nights of the past week forging it in secret while she slept. He held the handle toward her. Nora looked at the scraper. She let the dull, rusted piece of iron she was holding fall to the dirt floor. She reached out and took the custom steel scraper from his massive hand. Her fingers wrapped around the hickory wood. It fit perfectly. The weight of it grounded her. She looked at the blade. Then she looked at the giant. For the first time in 30 years, the tight, hard lines around Nora's mouth softened. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something deeper. It was peace. Elias gave a single slow nod. He turned away from the anvil. He walked over to the wooden crate where Nora kept her meager belongings. He picked up her thin, battered wool shawl. He walked to the main support beam near the hearth. It was the warmest spot in the forge. High on the timber, a single heavy iron railroad spike was driven deep into the wood. For 3 years, it had held only his heavy leather apron. Elias reached up. He carefully draped the older woman's battered shawl over the thick iron spike. resting it right beside his heavy leather apron. It was a permanent fixture. It was an anchor dropped in deep water. He walked to the wash basin, rolled up his sleeves, and began to scrub the dust of the town from his hands. Nora turned back to the anvil. She gripped the heavy hickory handle of her new steel scraper. She pressed the blade against the anvil face and pushed. It cleared the dried dough in one smooth, flawless motion, leaving the steel gleaming and clean. She began to measure out the flour for the evening bread. Outside, the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in deep bruises of purple and gold. The shadows lengthened in the yard, swallowing the broken wagon wheels and the frozen mud. But inside the thick stone walls, the darkness was held back. The heavy timber doors were shut tight. The iron latch was dropped. The wood popped and hissed in the great stone hearth, throwing a steady, brilliant orange glow across the polished tools and the clean floor. Two people sat by the fire, eating hot bread and listening to the wind outside. They didn't need the town's permission to exist. The lamp burned between them, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.